All right, so we'll get started. Thank you everyone for coming today. I'd like to, it's really my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce Dr. Ananya Vajpeyi. She's a fellow and associate professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. She's published numerous articles and edited volumes, one of which is her award-winning book, Righteous Republic, Political Foundations of Modern India, which was published by Harvard University. She's taught on a number of different continents and held a number of prestigious fellowships, so I'll just truncate the introduction. She's currently writing an intellectual life of Sanskrit in modern times, and particularly in India. And the title of her talk this afternoon is India's Second Republic. So thank you very much, Ananya.
Hi, good evening, and thank you all for inviting me and for coming to this talk. As you heard, I'm actually a pre-modernist and a historian and a classicist. I studied Sanskrit texts and intellectual history, but I also increasingly have been writing about politics and political theory in a more current and contemporary setting in India and in other parts of the world. James invited me very kindly, having read my book, which is titled Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India. And I'll just say a little bit about how we get from the Righteous Republic to what I'm calling the Second Republic, which is a sort of name that is being used more and more by political scientists and analysts and commentators in India these days to describe the kind of sea change that we're seeing in Indian democracy, Indian politics, and our sort of social political life in general under the current government of the Hindu nationalist party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is now in his 8th year of being Prime Minister, second term and 8th year. So Righteous Republic, my book, my first book actually came out 10 years ago, and it almost seems like a historical artifact in the short time that has passed since its publication. In that book, I looked at the moral, ethical, and historical bases for the imagining of a new nation state as India became independent. British rule ended. India was decolonized, and the post-colonial republic was set up in 1947 with a republican constitution that was promulgated in January 1950. So my book looked at how some of the main leaders of the nationalist movement, of the anti-colonial movement, who were also intellectuals in addition to being mass leaders, the sort of founders of the republic, if you would, how they drew on some historically old and traditionally well understood ideas about self and sovereignty that are available from political traditions and traditions of Indian thought within the Indian context, in Indian languages, and in various sort of South Asian cultures. So I try to look at how their training as modern lawyers, as modern scholars, as Anglophone, Anglophile, colonial elites, how this intersected with their sort of appeal to a greater public, to the Indian masses, and how they called up on older habits of thinking about self and sovereignty that are available within the Indian systematic traditions. I also looked at how they used sometimes very creatively, very interestingly, symbols of power, of moral power, of normative power, and of self-respect and self-fashioning through the arts, the architecture, the archaeology, the texts available from ancient times, through medieval times, into colonial rule, till we arrive at their moment in the early 20th century. So I looked at 5 founding fathers, in a sense. Gandhi, of course, Nehru, Ambedkar, Rabindranath Tagore, and his nephew, Abanindranath Tagore, who was sort of a founder of an Indian understanding of India's art history. He was a painter and an artist, and a very important member of the Tagore family, and helped create a sort of new sense of the aesthetic history of the Indian nation that was being imagined by all of these and many other men and women through the early part of the 20th century. My book tried to address these imaginings of a future for India, for decolonized India, for an independent India, that was nonetheless informed by a deep sense of selfhood, and had reference to a history beyond India's colonial chapter. But how to integrate all of the diversity of the Indian past, and how to sort of argue against the idea that came from the colonial academy and its disciplines that the Indian past was essentially dead. How to understand tradition as something that was still alive and still continued to inform everyday life, and everyday understandings and relationships in society, in culture, and in the polity more broadly. And some very inventive and creative uses, I would say, had to be brought into play for these leader intellectuals, these sort of founding figures, to appeal to the creative, to the political imagination of modern Indians, and to help them to understand that they need not continue to be colonized subjects of the British Raj. They could come into their own as proud Indians by achieving what Gandhi called Swaraj, which means self-rule. Many of you know Indian languages, you would know that. So when the Indian Constitution was being debated and written between 1946 and 49, it appeared as though all of the main influences on this sort of founding document, on this charter document, were going to be Western and liberal and democratic, and coming from the egalitarian and sort of modern democratic traditions of the Americans, of the French, of the British, of the Irish, and so on. And indeed, as a sort of person in charge of drafting the Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar did study all of this sort of political theory and history available from the Western world, from the modern world. And the Constituent Assembly did write a very, very liberal, very egalitarian, and truly sort of radical, radically democratic sort of constitution for India, which went directly from colonial rule to being the world's largest democracy, at least numerically to begin with, and slowly that meaning had to be filled out. As you know, India was created to be a secular, inclusive, plural state, nation state, where citizenship was not connected to religious identity, caste identity, gender, class, or any other kind of vector of personal identity. And the state was not beholden to any ethnic, racial, caste, or religious group and its interests. The whole point was to provide freedom and justice and fraternity and sort of bring together the enormous complexity and diversity of what had been the British Raj in the vision of the founders and in the vision of this constitution. Now, in 2020, the constitution became, from 1950, it became 70 years old. And in 2023, India will complete 75 years of independence from 1947. No, in this year, actually, starting August this year, we complete 75 years of Indian independence from British rule. And after all this time, we find that in the last 8 or 10 years, the character of political discourse, of political common sense, of even of the actual letter of the law, the character of court judgments in coming through India's high courts and Supreme Court benches, as well as the way in which people are voting, the way in which political parties are presenting themselves, campaigning, etc., in national elections and state elections and local elections. All of that is shifting away from a secular and broadly pluralistic default towards something different. And while it's very difficult to actually jettison the constitution or to change it entirely, and the scaffolding is so strong that it has to be sort of preserved to all appearances. And while we continue to have the world's largest elections, every 5 years, and the electoral cycle and the electoral process is more or less robust, it is a multi-party electoral parliamentary system, and it seems to work so far quite well. Despite that, the government currently in power for the last 7-8 years has succeeded in gradually shifting our common sense about what kind of country India is, what kind of republic it is, who India is for, who belongs in India, and the direction in which it's going, sort of rightward, is to say that it is more and more looking like a Hindu nation, a primarily Hindu nation, a nation for the Hindu majority, and one where religious minorities are increasingly treated as second-class citizens. They may not have lost their rights very literally yet on paper, but things are apparently moving more and more in that direction. And the question we have to ask is, are we entering a sort of formal phase of the Second Republic from 2014 onwards, which is when Prime Minister Modi came to power and the BJP took over at the center. So this is the kind of context in which we now sort of revisit and rethink the initial vision of the founders, which carried us through the early years of independence and the building up of the post-colonial republic and the sort of inauguration, as it were, of the democratic experiment in India, which has been by many counts very successful. It has given rights and justice to millions of people. In the last 20-30 years of economic reforms, it has also brought prosperity to more and more people who were sunk in poverty earlier. And India has seemed to come into its own, especially in this 21st century. But there has been a distinct sort of break with the direction economically, politically, and socially and culturally that India was moving in for sort of the first 60-65 years of independence, and now it seems to be entering a different phase of defining itself both internally as well as with regards to other democracies, as well as with regards to other world powers like China, like Russia, like the United States, like the European Union, and like other countries around the world that are sort of emerging powers, that are democratic, but now have authoritarian, populist, right-wing leaders, strongmen, countries like Turkey, like Brazil, like Poland, like Hungary, and so on. And India seems to be more and more sort of exhibiting common characteristics with some of these countries, rather than its older self-image as well as its older positioning in the Committee of Nations after the Second World War and after its own independence. I want to suggest that, and one can do this sort of very, very systematically, chronologically. One can also do it by simply talking about what has been happening in India in the last 7-8 years. But I don't want this to be like a news report. I mean, I assume that you're all interested in South Asia, and so you keep up with what's happening there. But I want to look at how this Second Republic, and the term I believe was initially used by Mukul Keshavan, who's a historian. He also writes about politics very, very much in the public domain. He's a sort of public intellectual and a very gifted writer. And he's the one who's been using this term more and more, and I think that more of us should adopt it. But this Second Republic is not, as perhaps it shouldn't be seen as surprising and shocking as the liberal and left sort of intelligentsia in India tends to see it as. How did the world suddenly change for India in 2014? How was it that Narendra Modi came to power on the back of such a huge electoral mandate? And how was he able to grow that mandate after 5 years of ruling in a way that completely changed the rules of Indian politics and made the political scene quite unrecognizable for other political parties, like the Congress, which had more or less held power for 50, 60, 65 years before that, the left parties, as well as a number of regional parties and smaller parties representing particular regional interests, caste interests, and other sorts of social formations. So how did this Second Republic suddenly appear on stage and completely eclipse all of India's post-colonial history up to 2014? So I want to suggest that there has always been a sort of shadow republic or a different India hiding hiding in the background, hiding in the shadows, hiding in the wings, and it has been there since partition. It has been there since independence, and it has finally come into its own with a very large popular mandate from basically the majority community, which is Hindu voters. Now, how is it that these same voters were voting for a secular Congress or for other kinds of, or for left parties or for other kinds of political parties all along, and then suddenly sort of went entirely in favor of the BJP? How, why did that happen? And I think this goes back a very long way to the years leading up to partition and independence, the 1940s, to the Constituent Assembly debates, to the partition and the independence of both India and Pakistan, the creation of Pakistan in 1947, simultaneously with the sort of decolonization of the British Raj in India. And most importantly, the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in January 1948 by members of the Hindu Right, a sort of Hindu Right organization, which now has finally assumed center stage in Indian politics. This organization, the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, sort of National Association of Volunteers, which is not a very sort of helpful name in the sense that it doesn't necessarily convey anything about the activities of this group, was founded almost 100 years ago in 1923-24. And its creators, its founders, its ideologues, its sort of intellectuals did not create it as a political party. They created it as a kind of ideological organization that would be culturally active in educating Indians. Educating them about what? Educating them about the propriety, the need, the necessity, and the eventual sort of, ineluctability, you could say, of India coming into its own as a Hindu nation. So the kind of governing ideology of the RSS is called Hindutva, or Indian. Indianness defined as the essence of being Hindu. Hindutva literally means being Hindu. But what is this? What does that mean, really, in terms of the relationship of this term, which is a coinage of Savarkar, the sort of counterpart to Gandhi, you could say, in the Hindu nationalist pantheon. What is the relationship of Hindutva, as he's trying to define it, with the Hindu religion? If we don't even think of Hinduism as one religion, then of all of the faiths that get clubbed under this umbrella, all the sects, all the different groups, all the different cultural, historical, religious, social communities that fall under this broad umbrella of Hindu. What is the relationship of Hindutva to that sort of religious complex? What is the relationship of Hindutva with the Indian nation, which is yet to come into being at the time when the RSS gets going and gets off the ground? And subsequently, what is its increasingly articulated, increasingly open and successful manifest connection with Hindu nationalism as it comes about through a party like the Bharatiya Janata Party, right? So Hindu nationalism as a political ideology, Hindutva as a political ideology, but related in a number of complex and sometimes not very clear ways with the religious identity, with the national identity, and with the political ideology. This is something that we have to understand as having been set into motion and having been at play already for 100 years. Now, at the time of the anti-colonial movement, or movements, because there were certainly many, at the time of the Constituent Assembly debates, at the time of the the processes that led up to partition and the creation of Pakistan and India as two separate nations, the leadership, presumably with public consent, apparently with public consent, opted not to define India on the basis, as I said, of any religion or ethnicity or majority or minority. And so India was not defined at that time in its constitution as a Hindu nation. Nevertheless, Hindu nationalists who, from the very beginning, through the RSS, through the Hindu Mahasabha, through other sorts of groups, opposed this new sort of charter for the newly independent Indian Republic. And they showed their displeasure at partition, which basically was meant to create a new homeland for British India's Muslims. They showed their displeasure that this was not a symmetrical outcome, that we didn't have a nation for Muslims and a nation for Hindus symmetrically on two sides of the border, but that there was Pakistan for the Muslims. And India, however, continued to say that it was not specifically for Hindus or for Muslims or for anybody except for Indians. The RSS showed its displeasure by literally assassinating the father of the nation, the leader of the anti-colonial movement for the previous 30, 40 years, Mahatma Gandhi, barely 6 months after independence. And this is at a time when he had been opposing, literally with his body, by going into riot-torn areas, communal violence between Hindus and Muslims, especially on the eastern front in Bengal, in Bihar and Bengal, where he had said that he would rather go and live in Pakistan than submit to this terrible division of Hindus and Muslims into separate communities, this large-scale death and destruction and displacement, the kind of violence, that the bloodbath that partition actually occasioned, when Gandhi had always stood for nonviolence or ahimsa, and where he had essentially never embraced the modern nation state in the way that things turned out. So to punish him for these views, Gandhi was in a sense killed by Nathuram Godse, who was a disciple, an acolyte of Savarkar, and subsequently the RSS became sort of persona non grata in the Indian political scene in the post-colonial period. During Nehru's regime, especially right into the mid-1960s, the Hindu right had to lie very low for what it had done in literally shooting down the very symbol of Indian Swaraj, namely Mahatma Gandhi. But through the late 70s and the 80s, the Hindu right reappears on the political scene and begins to once again invoke its old complaints and resentments about the presence of Muslims and the participation of Muslims in the Indian polity, the sort of relationship, mostly acrimonious, between India and Pakistan, which often erupts in war. In 1947, 48 in the first instance, in 1965 again, in 1971 again, when Bangladesh is created on the Bengal border, and splits off from Pakistan. In invoking this history, the Hindu right essentially tries to make the point that India made a wrong turn. It took a bad decision to be secular and inclusive. The communal question should have been settled at partition itself, and we needed then to form a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu Reich, a Hindu nation, at the same time that Pakistan was created as a Muslim homeland. Ex nihilo, in a sense, from what were parts of the British Empire. And this discourse has been gathering strength from the late 80s, early 90s, with a major flashpoint being the demolition of the Babri Masjid in December 1992 in Ayodhya, the Ram Janambhoomi movement, centered around a set of symbols involving the Hindu epic hero and the Vaishnav deity Ram, his supposed birthplace, also his kingdom in the epic, the Ramayana, Ayodhya, creating a whole set of myths and narratives around reclaiming Ram as a central symbol of Hindu pride and Hindu self-definition, but in a political sense, as a sort of people led by a great warrior king, a conquering king who is also a god, and whose story is well known in multiple narratives, in multiple versions of the epic, all across the Indian subcontinent, in many Indian languages, starting in Sanskrit, but also going into other languages. So the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992 really is a kind of, 30 years, right now, 30 years ago, is a kind of beginning of the ascent of the Hindu right into the national mainstream and into the public imagination of a reconfigured Indian polity, which rejects its own decisions to be secular, inclusive, oriented towards development, oriented towards justice, oriented towards equality, seeking to address problems of caste, of poverty, of various kinds of developmental backwardness, under a kind of vision of modern prosperity. All of that takes gradually becomes less important than this new way of defining India, in terms of religious identity, in terms of historical mythology, in terms of a sense of the past that is largely a sequence of many resentments against outsiders, against invaders, against foreigners, against others of various kinds, whom Ashish Nandi so memorably calls intimate enemies. And this stretches all the way back in Indian history to the arrival first of Islam to the Indian subcontinent in the sort of at the time that Islam comes into the world, more or less, at the beginning of the second millennium. The rule of most of India by Muslim rulers of various descriptions, whether it's the Mughals in the north or various sultans and dynasties in the Deccan and in the south in the medieval period, rulers of Turkic, Mongol, Arab, Persian, etc. origin, all of whom together completely transformed the cultural and social and political life of the subcontinent. Subsequently, colonization by the West and by the Europeans and the British, and finally a kind of self-colonization in the Hindu nationalist imagination by the highly westernized liberal and left-wing elite ruling classes after independence. So in a sense, Hindu nationalists see themselves as having to contend with the yoke of wave after wave after wave of power that is external to and that assaults the kind of Hindu self which hides at the core of India. And this now needs to assert itself. And if it can use the democratic and the electoral process to do so in terms which everybody understands as being legitimate, so much the better. If it needs to occasionally have excessive acts of violence, which are effectively promoted by or protected by the state and by the government in power, those also can be undertaken, whether it's small scale violence against individuals in a process that we call lynching in India, which is something that has been happening a lot, mostly against poor Muslims and poor Dalits in the last few years, or it's larger sort of rioting, targeted communal violence against Muslims, persecution of minorities, especially Muslims, in a variety of ways through institutions, through street violence, through media, through the kinds of things that you watch on television or read in the newspapers, or the kinds of movies that are getting made and so on. So whether it's popular culture or it's institutional life or it's politics as such, there's no hesitation more and more in asserting the emergence now of the Hindu Rashtra from this sort of veneer of Indian secularism, which has done us well, according to some, but not so well according to others, over the last 6, 7, 8 decades that India has existed. So in a sense, I'll just conclude by saying that that I didn't really understand the word righteous when I wrote my book to mean self-righteous. I really was thinking about visions of ethical sovereignty, of dharma, of the kinds of articulations that you find in the Ashokan edicts, that you find in the epics, in the Mahabharata, in the Ramayana, in so much of the Indian legal and political literature, in the sort of rule of the great monarchs of our past, whether Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist or Jain or any other, a sort of a wish to always temper power with justice. The centrality of nonviolence to Indian theories of rule. From the edicts of Ashoka to the sort of to the tactics of Gandhi. These are very, very powerful symbols of a certain kind of righteousness that has to be always aspired to on the part of the sovereign. And how did that integrate with democracy and with democratic visions of the will of the people articulating itself? Also similarly, in ways that were tempered by normativity, by virtue, by moral constraints on war and violence, and on the mistreatment or ill treatment of others. This was my thought in trying to capture how the founders struggled to integrate past and present and create a very different kind of vision for India's future after independence, and how they sort of embodied that in this very liberal, very enlightened, very progressive, very egalitarian constitution that they were able to write. More than 300 people thinking about everything for over 3 years under Ambedkar's stewardship and Nehru's leadership. And of course, with the blessings of Mahatma Gandhi. How has that now fallen away and given rise to a form of injured pride, sort of damaged self-respect, a sense of vengefulness, a revanchism, a sort of a reactionary politics that the Hindu right articulates. And why has the openness and the plurality and the protocols of toleration and of coexistence, living with difference, again, as Ashish Nandi says, being able to host the otherness of the other in one's midst, how have those habits of coexistence suddenly been abandoned by large numbers of people, apparently of their free will, in as much as the vote is a good index of choice and will and political judgment? How has that happened? What role has the discourse of the Hindu right over the last 100 years played in creating this atmosphere, which is sometimes can be reminiscent of Germany in the 1930s, for example, where from a very different time in the Weimar Republic, you suddenly have this vast popularity of a leader like Hitler, who is democratically installed in the first instance, of course. So what has happened? What has come out from the woodwork? What return of the repressed are we looking at? Who is stepping out from the shadows, in a sense? What is the unfinished business, as Pankaj Mishra has said, of partition that is being somehow mobilized at this point to talk about identity in very, very sort of in very, very aggressive terms, in terms that are also extremely defensive, and that do not bode well, I would say, whether politically or economically or in terms of international relations, or in terms of things like freedom of press and freedom of speech and genuine participation of men and women, of people across castes and across religions in the political process. These developments are alarming and seem to indicate that the Second Republic is well on its way, and that it has the support of the majority of Indians, in as much as those Indians are Hindus. But of course, we have to learn from history in order not to repeat it, of course. But we also have to ensure that that history is not used to justify various forms of injustice, which is what seems to be happening more and more. The way history is being recast, rewritten, falsified in some cases, reimagined, projected, both in the popular sphere as well as in the academy, in schools, in formal institutional settings, pedagogical settings. That all of that, so-called culture wars, what do we need to do to ensure that we are not actually undoing the righteous republic, and not sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, where we start off with so much promise and end up being not the world's largest democracy, but really in some sense the world's smallest smallest democracy, or maybe not even a democracy. So I'll just stop there, and I'd welcome questions. I know many of you are at the Oriental Institute and you are interested in questions of history of the pre-modern, pre-colonial past, and you're familiar with Indian languages. So we can talk about those if you would like, or we can talk about more current affairs as you prefer. Thank you so much.